that sort of the division between the very rich and everybody else is one of the things you talk about in this book, sort of polarization. I wanted to talk about it in terms of social media, because here we are recording an interview which will be shared on social media, and of course the people who watch it will be determined by who follows you, who follows Waterstones, an audience which is already sort of self-selecting. And there's this very interesting idea, isn't there, about social media, platforms like Facebook or Twitter, where people are speaking to their own friends and people who hold similar beliefs, and you get this polarizing of opinion and nobody hears the other side, and that's part of the problem that was thrown up in Brexit, wasn't it? People were very surprised by what they heard from other people when they finally actually listened to them.
So, social media complicates political debate in lots of ways, some of them really quite worrying. One is this point about the fact that we're all in our own echo chambers. So because of the way that we select the people we follow on a stream like Twitter, because of the way that algorithms in general on social media sites like Facebook broadly send us stuff that the algorithms say we're interested in, quite often that creates the problem that our views, some of them which may be wrong, will simply be reinforced because we just don't get challenged enough on social media, because social media just sends us the stuff that they think we are interested in. But that's one. But actually, there's a more serious problem than that, and it's the one that almost keeps me awake at night, along with many other things at the moment. The world is a fairly scary place, and it is that technologically we do not occupy a level playing field in terms of social media. And there are more or less sinister versions of that unlevel playing field. So the most sinister version is the fact that there is lots of evidence now that the Russian state intervenes in elections by manufacturing news stories, manufacturing comments in these so-called troll farms, which it then rather cleverly sends out to people who might be vulnerable to a particular kind of argument and have no way of knowing whether or not what they're receiving is simply a legitimate comment by an ordinary citizen or a legitimate news site, or is devious propaganda by Russian interests who want to just destabilise things. And you only have to look at the investigation into the way that the Russians hacked the Democratic Party's emails in the States, the way that they manufactured, I hate the phrase fake news now just because it's such a cliche, but it's genuine, it's a real phrase. I mean, false stories which people believed. In America, in other parts of the world. I mean, this is a genuine worry. But then there is something else that's going on, and that sort of cyber warfare is something we should all be concerned about. And nations like ours have to think much harder about how we protect our democracies from that kind of effectively external aggression and destabilization. But the problem is deeper than that, and it is that. There are sort of two classes of political campaigners now. There are political campaigners who understand how to scrape data from the internet and then target messages at voters who may be susceptible to those messages. And then there are the majority of politicians who are stuck in what you might call an analog world. And one of the things that was clear, for example, in the Leave-Remain battle in the referendum is that Leave was fantastically expert at finding out the preferences of millions of voters and then sending them relevant messages on social media, and indeed not just using social media to target those voters, but scraping data about them from the internet and then getting people on the ground to bang on relevant doors and make relevant, this was a very sophisticated digital campaign by Leave. And on the other side, Remain were fighting a battle that they could probably have, was similar to battles that have been fought, any time in the last 20, 30 years. And it was men against boys, and it was cruise missiles against handguns. And, it shouldn't be a surprise to us that, given that both sides went into the battle with roughly even, with the balance of support relatively evenly split between the two sides, if one is using massively more effective campaigning techniques, which Leave were, Leave ultimately won. Now, I'm not saying they're cheated. I'm not saying that, this means there has to be a rerun, but it does show that in the kind of world we're in, not having that understanding puts you at a massive disadvantage. And given the nature of the technology, it's not obvious, actually, that we're going to get a level playing field, absent, actually, regulators looking much more carefully about what a fair fight might look like. I mean, interestingly, in the last general election, I would say, although Labour's campaign in social media terms was less sophisticated than Leave, it was still quite effective and massively better the Labour social media campaign than the Tories, the government's, the Tories' social media campaign. So, when you layer the profound and complicated economic inequalities which drive behaviour, on top of the way that the dissemination of information is changing at a dizzying pace and creating, as I say, unlevel playing fields in the battle for the hearts and minds of different people. And on top of that, you've also got sense of economic injustice tipping over into all sorts of really important questions about who we are, identity. Nationalist movements rising at a rate that we haven't seen for years and years and years, whether it's Scotland or Catalonia. This is a hugely, it's fascinating if you do my job, trying to make sense of it, but it's a hugely complicated world and it's a hugely uncertain world.